Dr. Mina Carson, who is Associate Professor of History here in the Philosophy Department, or in the History Department, forgive me, who has been here for a while, doing some wonderful work in terms of activist history, LGBT history, and in the past few years has been doing some excellent work in recovering the biography of Ava Helen Pauling, and really highlighting how her work brought about the sort of peace consciousness of Linus Pauling in various ways, and how she pushed him in various ways to think about the ramifications of his work in a peace direction, and how they developed a synergy around peace education and peace activism, and how that she in her own right was quite a significant peace activist. And so here at OSU we have a lecture series, the Ava Helen and Linus Pauling Peace Lectureship, which is located in the School of the College of Liberal Arts, in which we bring in folks every year. Linus was very insistent that Ava's name be added to that lectureship. He wanted to make sure that her legacy as a peace activist was recognized also by OSU. And so we have Dr. Carson here to help us to understand a little bit about the relationship of the Paulings, the legacy of the Paulings, and particularly the work of Ava Helen. So I'll turn this over to Dr. Carson.
Thank you. Well, yeah, thank you, you guys. I wanted to get a sense of who you are, so I know, and then so that I have a sense of how new some of this is going to be, although I didn't ask you about that. I do, in fact, want to talk today about the marriage of Ava Helen and Linus Pauling, and also about what I've discovered in writing Ava Helen's biography, about her style of activism. Now, I got into writing the biography thanks to Linda. And I told a couple of people earlier, Linda Richards here, I told a couple of people earlier that I can show you this spot in the hall down here on the 3rd floor of Milam, when she stopped me and said, you know, Mina, was it 4 years ago at least? You know, Mina, OSU Press has been kind of wanting to do a biography of Ava Helen Pauling. And, you know, suggestible person that I am, I thought, well, that sounds like a good project. I'll do that project. And I was just coming from working on women in rock and roll, the history of women in rock and roll, with some wonderful colleagues of mine, Susan Shaw and Tisa Lewis. And earlier than that, and this is a little bit better fit in some ways, I had written about the settlement house movement at the turn of the century, focusing on a number of the leaders and trying to figure out how the animus and the philosophy of the settlement house movement, do most of you know what that was? Jane Addams, Lillian Wald, Graham Taylor, and so on. The animus and the philosophy of the settlement house movement grew out of really 19th century culture, although it emerges from, and 19th century Anglo-American culture, although it emerges from the turn of the century America. So it was a lovely stew of ideas and impulses. And so I've always been interested in, and then I took a rather a long side journey into social work, and I earned while I was out here teaching history, I earned a social work credential, and did some practicing in social work with a real emphasis on both on family dynamics and on trauma, treatment of trauma. And then I decided to finish that story. I decided to be a parent and realized that, you know, 2 careers and 2 children, there was just too much going on. So social work has rested. And I bring that up because, of course, the things that you learn about paying attention to families and family dynamics and the ways in which women in particular grow up in the society and the ways in which gender plays out in the lives of men are really appropriate to do in biography, and of course, a biography of anyone, but particularly activists in a way. So that's what I've been up to, and my book should be out in April or May. We should have the first copies from the OSU Press in April. So I'm kind of hoping I sound clever today, because in fact I'm supposed to know everything by now. It's all on the pages. But I've asked Linda to please step in whenever I misspeak about the Paulings. I know a lot more about Ava Helen than I do about Linus. good reason. And I won't go into that, but I do know a few things about Linus, and certainly about his approach to peace, to conflict resolution, to anti-war activism. One of the Paulings' friends, when Linus won the Peace Prize for 1962 at the end of 1963, it was announced then. One of his friends wrote, a number of their friends actually wrote and said, you know, this probably should have been for both of you. Others wrote to newspapers and said, you know, this is a scandal that he was even recognized, and I'll come back to that. But one of their friends wrote and said, you know, everybody should know that it was really a team of Paulings that made all this happen. Linus, of course, won the Nobel Peace Prize for several decades of activism, but largely, or a decade and a half really, but largely for having organized with Ava Helen the Oslo Conference on elimination of nuclear weapons, the non-proliferation of nuclear weapons in 1961. And I hope to show you a few pictures of that, but I just wanted to mention that was the context for talking about a team of Pauling. So I wanted to front load the argument and then show you a lot of chat, show you some pictures of the Paulings, because as you'll see this afternoon, the Pauling archive here in Special Collections is just rich with stuff, overwhelmingly rich with stuff. And I'm just going to show you a few of the pictures, but all of the pictures are digitized. I don't think they are available on the web without going to the archive, but many isn't really the answer. Very precise answer. Lots and lots. Ava Helen and Linus did, they were married in 1923, and they really followed from the beginning a traditional division of labor in their marriage. But from the beginning, their emotional and spiritual relationship was quite egalitarian and symbiotic. And this is not unusual. At the end of the book, a very good critic who read the book said, you know, what is this whole story? How can you broaden the whole story and tell us more about marriages in the 19th and 20th centuries? And that was fun. And I couldn't look at all marriages, but I could look at the biographies that had been done. And although Ava Helen and Linus were unique and special, they also represented really a handful of prominent marriages that kind of found a way, often uncomfortable, found a way to both live in fairly traditional gender roles and also act together, well, as a team, each contributing what they could. In the case of the Paulings, and I want to come back to this a little bit, you know, when you do the biography and you're lucky enough to have living informants, Linus Pauling Jr. has been extraordinarily generous with his time and information, reflecting. He lives in Hawaii and he flies back and forth to here and speaks at various Pauling events. And he has sat down with me for a couple of hours and on several occasions. He sat down with Chris Peterson for over a week's time, just recently, giving his memories. And it's particularly generous because he ends up, he's in his early mid-80s, and he ended up feeling pretty cheated by his parents' devotion to each other in his position as the oldest child. And he really feels very strongly that Ava Helen, that mothering was not her thing. He's right about that. But he in particular got, the oldest and the youngest in the Pauling clan got cheated.
How many did they have?
Four. And so it was Linus Jr., Peter, Linda, the only girl, and then Cronin, who was named after not a building on the Caltech campus, but the donor of the building. So anyway, leaving that aside, leaving their parenting aside, Ava Helen's devotion was to Linus. Her devotion was to the marriage. But as time went on, her devotion also became to social justice causes. And I'm going to put it this way, because this is the way I think it works. Among her social justice causes was peace. That was what brought her to peace work, and I'll come back to that. But she really did inspire Linus. Linus grew up a very inactive Republican. He was a chemist. He was a bright kid. He was a self-made child and a self-made man, not very well parented at all. And Ava Helen is the one in the marriage who kind of brought him, pushed him to politics. And of course, once Linus got there, well, he was a good student and became a great spokesman for peace and for lay understanding of the deadliness of nuclear weapons. Because of the official harassment their politics invited, they had to decide. They felt they had to decide on a position on anti-communist persecution that, of course, dominated the very late 40s and the 1950s and well into the Kennedy administration. They decided not to appease or tolerate the Red Baiters. And they were really among the boldest of Americans who were persecuted for liberal stances. Do I even need to say that the stance made them seem a bit naive? They did visit Russia at one point. Russia's great. The Russians are happy, and so on and so on. So, they did kind of take, they were not fellow travelers. They were never communists. They had no patience for that. But because of the realities of global politics in the 50s and 60s, they tend to look a little bit naive in retrospect. Wonderfully naive, intelligently naive, idealistically naive. But still, I have to acknowledge that. But they made that choice. They were very courageous. Ava Helen herself really took wing in the late 1950s and early 1960s. She had joined a very important group called the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, of which Linda is briefly an expert. And she worked very hard with them, but ultimately, for a number of reasons, many of which did not rest with Wilf, I have to say, found Wilf limiting, a little bit ethnocentric, and conflict-ridden, and that during the Cold War was quite true. During that early part of the Cold War was quite true. She joined when the Women's Strike for Peace came on the scene, and many of you probably know about these groups, given your expertise. When Women's Strike for Peace came on the scene in the early 1960s, she didn't jump ship, but her energies moved from WILF to WISP. She didn't quit WILF, although she didn't run for the board again. I'll come back to that. But she was very excited about WISP, which was a very different approach. Not at all top-down, very democratic, very spontaneous, very, very interesting. Her activist methods, as I say, were democratic, imaginative, and they didn't engage in red baiting on purpose. And their organizational structure was such that they could repel official inquiries by saying, well, we don't really have membership lists. No, there aren't really any leaders. No, I don't know anything about her, and I don't know who's in the Communist Party because we don't have a list. So, and then in 1963, Ava Helen had been moving slowly, and then suddenly in the early 60s, rather quickly, into feminism. And when she became a feminist, she became a very articulate feminist. Betty Friedan beat her, and Ava Helen did not write a book. But she was the age of Betty, or she was a peer in terms of speaking out on feminism of Betty Friedan and Simone de Beauvoir. She called a talk that she gave in a number of places, the Second X Chromosome, and enunciated really what we would today call a liberal feminist viewpoint, as opposed to a socialist feminist or whatever. Anyway, so that's kind of front-loading what I have to talk about. This was I love this quote, and it actually is the title of one of the chapters of the book. Although the OSU copy editor, who's a fabulous person, wrote to me and said, that's a little creepy, isn't it? And I'm glad she said that, because I hadn't thought of it that way. But they were so connected, Linus and Ava Helen, that Linus really didn't enjoy traveling without Ava Helen. And it's one of the very concrete things that made the Paulings' parenting rather questionable. Because really from the 30s on, i.e. from the time that young Krellen was 4 or 5 years old, Ava Helen mostly, when Linus was out of town, as often as she could, she would travel with him, leaving the children to a series of babysitters, you know, graduate students, colleagues, people down the street, you know, as they traveled around. There was one summer, Linus was diagnosed with
that disease we can't say.
glomerulonephritis.
Nephritis.
Yes.
The last is for nephritis.
Usually at that time a fatal disease, actually. And because and he was giving a talk on the East Coast, and because his friends on the East Coast were clever enough to know the right medical connections, they sent him back to the West Coast and this is where my middle-aged brain has fallen apart. Who was his? Thomas Addis, Scotsman, and a fabulous doctor who was experimenting. Who was experimenting with the new, but you know that, with the new treatment of nephritis that was dietarily based. And so Ava Helen, this was in 1941, and so Ava Helen became, for the next 6, 7, 8 years, kind of a co-researcher. She developed a diet that essentially saved Linus's life, but it was one more excuse, in a sense, reason/excuse for her to travel with Linus. He was diagnosed in, I believe, March 1941, bedridden for a couple of months, but by July he was traveling again, and she went with him. And all 4 children, no, the 3 youngest children were sent to summer camp in California, including Krellen, who by my estimates was just a little blighter. Well, they went off, you know, for a month and did their thing. So, you know, that's where this quote comes from. They loved each other and they loved to travel together. They were dependent on each other. Ava Helen's motivation, I mentioned this, but Ava Helen's motivation for peace work is really important, I think, in understanding, of course, in understanding her, that's the core of her, but also in understanding Linus's approach and his activities. I've finally decided that the way to think about it is it was not peace per se that motivated her, but fairness and social justice. She got fired up about things. She was not really, although she was always a liberal Democrat, and as I say here, her father, who left the family when she was about 8, still must have had a very profound impact on her, because she grew up left liberal leaning and social justice oriented, and very outspoken. I haven't really characterized her yet for you. But she shared her father's orientation, although I think she never, ever, she had no connection with him, never forgave him for leaving, and yet carried his politics all her life. And what she got, when she finally got involved, there was a little chapter in Pasadena by the early 30s at the very latest. She did not join. And although one of the faculty wives that she was closely connected to was a member, she was not. She didn't join until later. And I kind of discovered in the documents that it may have been that she really hated this gal that she didn't join at the time. But I don't know that. I don't know. So, but what got her activated was Nazi aggression, and then the persecution of the Japanese Americans. You know. So Linus did war work. They were patriotic and Americans who very much were interventionists and very much wanted. They joined the Union Now movement in Los Angeles in 1940, and they very much wanted America to get involved with the war. But that was the kind of thing that got her going. And when peace became, and anti-nuclear activism after World War II became a matter that was urgent, she was, you know, that was what moved her. And what about her feminism? Her feminism, not, you know, I said belated here, but then I went back and edited because for a woman of her age and class, her feminism really wasn't belated. In fact, in a sense, it was forward. She was born in 1903, so she was 60 years old. She was my age by the time she became a feminist. But as I say, she plunged right into it. In a sense, by then, her feminism was overdetermined. She was bright. She spent her first 2 married decades protecting her husband's professional time and pushing his career as a chemist. She, although, as I have said, it's really all evidence that mothering was not her, not the first, you know, primary mover of her being. She did the child rearing, and Linus was really rarely home. I mean, even when he was in Pasadena, he was at the office, he'd come home. They always had family dinners, and that the kids remember that that was very important to them. That's where they were introduced to talking and thinking and so on. And Ava Helen sometimes left the discipline to Linus, which is kind of hilarious because he was very bad at it. But there were those years when she was at home, he was at the office. The kids were demanding, and there wasn't much going on for her except all of that, which, as many of you know, is a lot. Then you add into the mix, as I just said, some level of her ambivalence about motherhood. When she first became publicly visible, although, you know, that wasn't how it had worked, she became visible as Linus's sidekick, you know, in the public eye, although she had been the one to join these groups. She was the one who kind of developed these ideas in a sense, or the way that they might best approach the anti-nuclear activism. He was an academic and she was not, although throughout their lives he would say, now Linus Jr. would say, you know, unfairly, that Linus, his father, had overrated his mom's intelligence. That's kind of not very nice, but you know, Linus Jr. said, look, my mom was not an abstract thinker, and that's quite true, but she was very bright. They once took one of those magazine intelligence tests when they were both in their 20s, and she scored better than he did, and he was like, wow, and he would sort of push her forward that way, which was nice. She was very bright. She didn't finish college. She married instead. She was in the middle of her second year here when she and Linus just couldn't stay away from each other. He had already gone to Caltech and they married. So she never finished college. She was very much self-educated. Again, in that time and place, it's not surprising. She was well-read and pretty serious about being well-read. She joined the ACLU in the 1940s and joined the board in the LA region. And then, as I mentioned, wrote for WISP. Yeah. And you know, I asked this question here, and I don't even know why. I mean, it's too profound for me to answer, but you know, I'm wondering if she could have completed her peace career without a feminist conversion. And she probably could have. She's one of these characters, and as I say, I haven't characterized her yet, but let me go to the next slide. Here's a lovely, this is a great picture. I cut off his head, I didn't mean to. Because he had this kind of wild curly hair when he was an undergraduate. It was one of the things that drew her to him here at Oregon Agricultural College. But she was, I just broke in my own thought. I'm sorry, I'll start again. She was petite, flirtatious, bright and bubbly. She was, well, I think, president of her high school class. Do you remember that at all? She was one of the organizers of the senior class picnic. She rushed through Salem High School, finishing in 3 years. And then down here. She, by the way, she was one of 12 children, and one of the younger. 12 children whom her mom essentially raised by herself, and a number of her older sibs had preceded her at OAC. So even though the family was not wealthy, her mom very much oriented to sending the kids to college if she could at all persuade them to go. But anyway, so she was a lively character. And she met Linus. When should I stop, Roberta?
In 15 minutes.
Oh, okay, great, because I just want to show you some pictures and chat a little bit more. But she met Linus. He was her instructor. He was an undergrad. He was already brilliant in chemistry, and was poverty-stricken. He worked in the summers on a road crew here in Oregon. He was a paving plant supervisor, so he wasn't in supervisory capacity. He had to have that money to come back to school, and his mom, who was a pretty unstable character, who also was widowed, actually, not abandoned, but widowed, abandoned in that sense. And the first year that he worked for his second year scholarship, he sent his money home to her, and she spent it. And so he was out of school until the chemistry department here called him and said, "Would you like to teach? We got a couple sections. Would you like to teach?" So as a sophomore, he started teaching chemistry. And she was in the College of Home Economics here in Milan Hall. I believe it was in Milan Union. They took 2 years, a year and a half or 2 years of chemistry actually in home economics. And he was her instructor, and they noticed each other. And within a short time, they were dating, and fell in love, like, really fast. Here he's receiving his PhD. So he went on to graduate school at Caltech, and she stayed here, as I said, but then after he spent a year down there, or actually in the middle of his first year down there, they were already engaged. I mean, they were engaged within a couple of months, secretly engaged within a couple of months of meeting each other. And it really was one of those soulmate things. You know, they were sexually completely compatible, and they discovered that very early, apparently. And so another really interesting thing about their marriage is it sheds additional light on the fact that, all of that celibacy that we assume went on, from the mid-19th century to the early 20th century is really not, doesn't have much of a basis in reality. And we know that through a wonderful series of love letters that Linus sent to Ava Helen. He burned her letters. We don't have them. He didn't burn, thank heaven, he didn't burn her organizational letters. I don't think it was an act of hostility. No. It was an act of respecting her privacy. And his letters are so sexually explicit that we have to assume that hers were too. I mean, we don't have to, but being a good historian, I have to say, we can't assume that, but we kind of are 95% sure that they were pretty explicit. And he just didn't want, and then the ones that didn't come up to us are in Linda Pauling's hands. Linda Pauling, again.
Her married name.
Yeah.
Linda Pauling works.
I'll get it in a minute.
Yeah.
Get it in a minute. But anyway, she's been very, very protective of the family documents that she's had hold of. And we haven't been able to pry them out of her hands. Linus Jr. hasn't been able to pry them out of her hands. And so, they're the two living Pauling children. And then, these are the stories that come to a biographer. We were interviewing another family member who told us, let's see, how much can I say without, well, I guess it's really part of the public record now, but she found like a diary or a daybook of Ava Helen's that she kept as of in the 60s and 70s. No, earlier than that, because she said she found this daughter-in-law, found this book, And because of the way in which Ava Helen wrote about her marriage and her child rearing, she decided the daughter-in-law decided she never wanted her husband to see it. So she just couldn't. So there's some stuff that we don't have, like a lot of stuff that we don't have. But thank heaven some letters slipped into the cracks and there's little interstitial places between his letters, and so we know a little bit. But his letters are absolutely fabulous, and we have a run of, maybe 18 months, but still, like daily letters for 18 months as they're both in their 20s courting each other. This is Linus Jr. between his parents. A beautiful, wonderful, perfect family. You see how gorgeous she is here, and how Linus Jr. kind of picked up the kids all were just so handsome and so smart, and in several cases so troubled. Ava Helen was perhaps not the mother most of us longed for, and I have to add, am I? I mean, if my children are as mentally healthy as I hope they are, I think that they would say, Mom, are you? So, still, as the biographer, I have to kind of tell the truth. But again, a lovely, although a little bit more anxious looking formal portrait. 1943. This is actually one of the last, you're not going to believe this, but this is Linus Jr. So we have Linda, Linus Jr., Peter, and Krellen, young Krellen. Linus Jr. was actually, he may have at this point, I can't remember whether it was 42, 43, but he joined the military as fast as he could when war was declared. And it was his way of getting out of his family. Now I gotta say that Linus, his father, even at that point, as any good parent would, tried to strategize with his oldest son. How can we get you a military assignment that's not going to put you on the front lines and get you made into hamburger? And so they tried several ways to get him into, like, I can't remember, the medical corps or something. And then he wanted to try to join the Air, no, not the Air Force, the Army Air Corps, and washed out as a pilot for a number of reasons. Ended up a radar and radio guy, which was completely and utterly appropriate for him. He was an electronics kid, just like his brothers were. Their electronics, cars, etc. Anyway, so that was one of the last of the pictures of the family altogether. Until actually, I wonder if I can show you this one. This is one of my favorite pictures of Ava Helen. Linda and I have had a number of talks about who she was as an activist, what was her style. And I think you came up with the swirler, the swirling. It was such a wonderful description of who she was. She really didn't do very well, although in the ACLU she was a board member for quite a long time in the LA chapter. But she was not an organizational person in the sense that lots of people like stick to it and are patient with the minutia and all that. She liked connecting people. She loved giving speeches, and she was apparently fairly good at it. She liked connecting people. She had a global correspondence, and she loved that, and she was very good at maintaining it. She was charming, and she was deliberately charming. And one of her Linus's young cousins, not her nephew, but a cousin-in-law, but younger, who absolutely adored her, also said very frankly that she was always on stage, that she was one of these characters who's always aware that people are looking at her. And that's fine. That's honestly it's who she was, and it's largely what made her effective. I want to show you if I can find the pictures. I'm going to run through. Yeah, I think I've said all this. This is the photograph that he was refused his passport in 51, 52, and he had several go-rounds with the passport office because they said, and he was going to go to Great Britain, and it was at the time, you know, when the DNA was a big deal, and his son was actually already working in the lab, in the Watson and Crick lab, and anyway, you know, one of the excuses that he had later for not figuring out DNA, he didn't make a lot of excuses, but was, well, I wasn't able to go to England at that meeting, and I didn't hear the important stuff. But he actually, he had a better and more honest and kind of, what do I want to say, bemused explanation. He did a transatlantic voyage in the late 40s, was it? With one of the guys who was figuring out, it wasn't Watson or Crick, it was someone else. And he said, if I had just listened to that guy, but he was so boring. If I had just listened, I wish I could give you his name. You should ask Ann Beatty when you go over there. Who was that guy on the ship? Who was that guy on the ship? But anyway, he said, you know, he was too boring and I couldn't listen to him, so I missed my chance to learn this. Anyway, he made plenty of other discoveries. All right, Will talked about that. Oh, what I want you to see is this. This is like 1960. This Lottie Meitner-Graf was a fairly important portrait photographer at the time. Sorry, this is a funny, one of my wonderful undergrads brought me some photos, and this was the way I could reproduce it, so it's, you know, a picture turned on its side from Windows or something. But anyway, it's a wonderful picture. The Wilf was still the ladies in the hats, and she was too. This is a bizarre hat, though, I have to say. Okay, so WISP, and I talked about WISP. Yes. And, oh, listen, one of the important things about WISP, and some of you may know this, but it was really a bridge from anti-nuclear protest into anti-Vietnam protest. And if you see a little bit, I haven't seen any of their correspondence out. Oh no, I saw a little bit out at the Swarthmore College Peace Collection. Which is, oh, have you guys visited? Some of you visited? Oh, you would love it if you ever get a chance to go to Swarthmore College Peace Collection. Do it. Any excuse, just do it. I mean, it's this little room like this in the basement, but they have everything. It's very, very cool and very, very accessible. But anyway. WISP is really one of the bridges from the peace activism of the early 1960s into the very full-blown anti-Vietnam activism of the mid to late 60s. And the Paulings were very early on that bandwagon. I know I just have a couple of more things to say. I wanted to mention, okay, so here's her second X chromosome speech that she gives in 63. And she gives it at the Unitarian Church, the First Unitarian Church of Los Angeles. And she and Linus got connected with that church. They were both non-believers. And in fact, I think it's Linus Jr. It's Linus Jr. McCrellin, and other very different guys, but who said that when they said, well, what should I say that I'm an atheist? The kids were asking their parents, and they said, you know, it's just so interesting, it's so politic, right? It might make more sense to say you're an agnostic. You know, in the 1950s, that's very good advice to a kid who's already living under the shadow of these parents who are coming under all this scrutiny for their political beliefs. But they were never churched until they met Stephen Fritchman of this Unitarian church, and he was a wild-eyed radical. Oh my God, he was beyond the Paulings, and they linked up. He came after Linus and said, you know, come give talks at our church. Come talk about anti-nuclear stuff. Come talk about. And by the way, what was the most important scientific discovery of, you know, of the 1950s? And you know, and he came after them, and the two couples, his wife Frances, and Linus and Ava Helen, became really good buddies into the mid 1960s. In fact, Ava Helen died in December '81, and Fritchman didn't preside over her funeral because he was her memorial service because he resigned at the same time. But it became a spiritual home for them. It became a way for them to understand more deeply their convictions. I better stop, huh? Because you guys have to go away and I haven't given you any chance to respond. I want to make one more observation. This is a photo that my student found for me that is very important. Kurt Bauer, one of Ava Helen's friends, after Ava Helen gives a Second X Chromosome talk, I think they send this out at Christmas or something. But anyway, Kurt Bauer looks at this and says, why is Linus leaning on the fence and you're a few steps back? I mean, what is this? I mean, you know, and this is before they build. This is at in the ranch on the coast, Big Sur, before they built this big fancy house that they finally built. But you know, she goes on and on. So I'm hoping we can get copyright for this, you know, so I can put it in the book. Copyright permission to put this in the book. I'm blobbing and blobbing. You're going to go to the OSU Special Collections, and I'm really glad about that. And I'm going to stop and see if anyone's got, I think there's room for like one or two questions or comments. Anything? Oh, sorry.
Do you think you would be well described as a nuclear pacifist? That is, someone who believes that after nuclear weapons came into being, then war is obsolete? Or was he opposed to war as a matter of principle?
I think both, but I think that's a great question, and I may be...
He was supportive of World War II.
Yes.
Did he fundamentally change after?
He fundamentally changed after when he saw the devastation of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And he had had the opportunity to be one of those scientists, but had chosen not to be one of them. He was friends with Oppenheimer, and he had been actually friends with quite a few physicists, because in 1926 he had a Guggenheim Fellowship. And he went to Europe and he hung out with Wolfgang Pauli and Oppenheimer, and he actually heard some of the very first lectures that were ever made on mechanics. And a whole crew of the people who would later work on the bomb. But when he saw the pictures in the newspaper, just saw it on the cover of the newspaper like anyone else, it deeply affected him. And within a month, he was making speeches about nuclear weapons. But he wasn't necessarily talking about the politics. He was explaining to people how they worked. But he was very upset about them being used.
Yeah.
He decided that if you got rid of nuclear weapons, it would be a first step to end all war. And I believe it was Ava Helen's influence with her ideas about social justice that made him feel that he had to get rid of all war. That the only logical, scientific explanation of how to live together would be to have law instead of war.
Yes, that's very good.
And it's such a long answer.
That's one. Thank you so much. She's really good. And they very much broadened it. And you're the one who called my attention to this. Although I don't pay enough attention to it in the book, but they very much their stance broadens from anti-nuclear to kind of pro-Earth. I mean, that's really they become kind of eco-radicals.
Yeah, they do.
And one of the money legacies that she leaves is to preserve forest. I'm sorry.
The redwoods?
Huh?
Was it the redwoods?
It was, but yeah, I'm going to stop there. You had a...
Yeah, I think as well, he became part of Einstein's group, right?
Yes,
and
yes.
That was a major force for that. In your readings, so Ava was the primary impetus moving Linus towards social activism, but then here's where my question then comes in from that. Did she remain the ongoing catalyst for him to continue to move into social activism, or did it become a little bit more synergistic? Was there a give and take back and forth? You mentioned like that they had traditionalist roles, but they were egalitarian somehow in their cohesion together. Did that also occur within their activism, or is that, you're not sure?
You know, no. I would say no in that I'm trying to picture what that would look like. It would be Linus saying to Ava Helen, you know, you really haven't, or you should be more active in this, or why don't you look at this? And that may have happened, and he's not in a position of like hanging back. There's one time, and I think I said it in one of the slides that I sped through, but at one point in 51, he finds that he's really, the political attacks are so strong that they're getting in the way of his chemistry. And he says, look, I can't do both. And she said, you're right, lay off. It didn't make any difference. They still came after him, so he said, well, hold it, then I'm gonna. And so he is the face of all that, but she's not feeding him stuff. He becomes, of course, extremely articulate. He was always he was apparently a really brilliant teacher. I don't know, I never saw him speak.
Yeah, his teaching, his whole idea of teaching, there's a lot of teachers who study him as a teacher.
Yes, exactly. He could come into a classroom with no notes, just make this presentation that helped people spellbound. And you know, and that's kind of who he was, and that's what one of the things that he could carry. Yeah,
the reading room is actually a donation. You'll see Douglas Strain's name on the reading room. He was a grad student of Linus Pauling's and never stopped loving him.
He was funny and very generous, I think, as a graduate teacher. He was ultimately pushed out of his position as
and he got the prize.
Chemical division. And his Caltech people, his own department did not recognize his second Nobel Prize. It was the biology people who gave him a little tea to sell. I mean, it was bizarre behavior. And the trustees, there was a faction of the trustees at Caltech who just tried to push him out from the early 50s on.
I think it shows that courageous energy they had. Like, it really wasn't okay to question atmospheric testing, and he was totally doing that. And even when he was successful, he'd gotten the atmospheric test entry, and that's why he gets the Nobel Prize. So he's been successful at ending atmospheric testing, pretty much gotten the world credit for that, and his own department doesn't hold it.
Right, and his Time magazine, who said a weird insult from Norway.
You'll see all that in the archive.
Yeah.
He was very, very brave, and the red baiting was everywhere. It was happening everywhere, and that they took that stand and said, we want communists in our group. They actually, there's some quotes of Ava saying, we want communists in our group because that's who are considered our enemies. So why wouldn't we want to make peace with our enemies? I think it's fabulous.
Yeah, really interesting, because when some of the Wilf chapters got hung up with.
Oh, they did.
Oh man, they really did. You know, with red baiting themselves and seeking and sane, you know, went through a horrible period of time. Anyway, I know I gotta stop here, but the Paulings always said, you know, as you said, you know, communists we gotta make peace with the Soviets, and why would we keep them out of our country?
Yeah, it's like really cool.
Are you supposed to stop me, Joseph? Are you supposed to stop me, Roberta? Am I supposed to stop myself?
No, I guess
the tour.
The tour, we have to go over to special collections now at 12:45 and meet Anne there for the beginning of the tour. So we might go ahead and wrap up here and then start getting organized to walk over to the library. So why don't we go ahead and thank Mina.
Thank you so much.